Let me summarize briefly those two contentions I said I would defend tonight. First, are there good reasons to think the Christian concept of God is true? It seems to me that we've definitely seen that there are. First, that Jesus claimed to be the unique divine Son of God. Dr. Badawi says in his last speech, "Oh, you accused me of saying things I never said." What I meant was that he didn't refute the things. Thereby, he gave tacit admission in the debate to them in that he didn't dispute them. He hasn't disputed the authenticity of any of the sayings of Jesus that I gave. And moreover, I don't think he's been able to rob them of their full theological significance. Consider the parable of the vineyard. All he's able to say is the word servant is often used in the Bible of human figures. Fine, but that says absolutely nothing about the significance of the parable, where Jesus differentiates himself from all the prophets by being God's unique and special Son. Matthew 11:27, he's dropped the point about God or Jesus being the only revelation of God the Father. He responds to John 1:18 by saying that the divine bosom of the Father doesn't mean that he's God. Granted, it's the phrase, the only begotten God, that indicates Jesus' divinity. He didn't dispute that. Mark 13:32, again, he dropped that point. Instead, he turns to my point about Jesus forgiving sins by saying, well, in the Quran, the property of forgiving sins is ascribed to people. But that's irrelevant. What's in the Quran? The question is, in the Jewish context, in first century Palestine, was this possible for a human being to do? No, as we've seen, that was blasphemous because only God can do it, and yet Jesus did so. Finally, about Thomas saying, my Lord and my God, he says this isn't a bad translation. My point here is that the Greek is clear. I've got a Greek New Testament here, and the words are the God of me and the Lord of me, and that is a full Christological confession to the deity of Christ. So we've seen no good reason to dispute my first point, that the historical Jesus conceived of himself to be the divine Son of God. Second, his resurrection vindicates his radical claim. Notice that in tonight's debate, Dr. Badawi has not disputed the facts of the empty tomb, the resurrection appearances, or the origin of the Christian faith. All he said now in the last speech is this remarkable statement, but I could admit these things and it doesn't make any difference. Of course it makes a difference, because then the Quran is wrong. Because the Quran says Jesus was not crucified, much less raised from the dead. So if you're going to grant these things, then you cannot be a Muslim. So it seems to me that this is critical to the debate this evening. Moreover, I argued that the resurrection in the historical context in which it occurred confirms Jesus' radical claims for which he was crucified. If God raised this man from the dead, that is God's divine imprimatur or vindication of those allegedly blasphemous claims for which he was crucified. So I think we've got very good reasons for affirming the Christian concept of God. Pardon me. What about the reasons for thinking the Islamic conception of God is true? I argued that the Islamic conception is morally inadequate because God is not all-loving. Dr. Badawi repeats his assertion that these expressions in the Quran mean I love virtue and hate vice. But the problem is that's not what it says. It says, I love not unbelievers, sinners, the proud, and so forth. He says, but the Quran says we honor the children of Adam, we give our spirit to man. Yes, it says that. But nowhere does the Quran affirm that God loves unbelievers, that God loves sinners. He only loves those who love him. His love is conditional and partial. He says, but you don't end up in heaven because of your righteous deeds. Perhaps not. But they are a prerequisite. And therefore, if you do not have them, God does not love you. And that is the bottom line in the Quran. But that's a morally inadequate conception of God, I submit. Secondly, is the conception of Jesus historically inadequate? Here, Dr. Badawi hasn't been able to defend the conception of Jesus in the Quran at all, only by saying that the story in the infancy gospel of Thomas maybe should be regarded as inspired after all. Now that's incredible, because that's a forgery from 200 or 300 years after the death of Christ. Moreover, it contains horrid stories about the boy Jesus striking his playmates dead because they don't do the things he wants. Is Dr. Badawi seriously going to say that's inspired of God, and that's why it can be included in the Quran? That's incredible. He says there are other scholars who deny the crucifixion of Jesus. I am so confident that that is false, I challenge him to name one. There is no New Testament scholar who denies the crucifixion of Jesus. So I think the Quran clearly has a historically inadequate conception of Christ. In closing, I simply want to say that I myself was not raised in a Christian home. But as a teenager, I began to read the pages of the New Testament, and I found the person of Jesus of Nazareth to be arresting and captivating. After a 6-month search, I came to give my life to him personally, and I experienced God in a transforming manner. I believe that you can find him in this same way if you will search for him, search the New Testament with all your heart, and ask if this really couldn't be the truth. I think it can change your life in the same way it changed mine. Thank you.